Something whispered behind bars can echo louder than any crime scene, but echoes can also lie. Hit the subscribe button now and turn on your bell so you get first-hand updates on this story and others as they develop. When someone in custody claims they know what really happened, that claim hums with possibility. It promises answers where none existed. Yet the very conditions that create that possibility are the same conditions that make such claims fragile. Inmates live in systems where favors, bargains, and survival shape behavior. A whispered story that promises reward or relief can be as much strategy as confession, and that basic fact, that the person speaking often has something to gain, is the first reason jailhouse statements invite skepticism. Beyond motive, the circumstances of disclosure matter. Confessions uttered during conversations on a cell block bunk, repeated to other inmates, or passed through intermediaries are vulnerable to change. Memory is malleable. Recollections morph as they are retold. An account that begins fuzzy can gain dramatic color through repetition. Details are smooth, dates shift, and motives get reframed until the story reads like a narrative designed to please a listener. When those listeners are investigators or prosecutors, incentives to craft a convincing account only grow stronger. Manipulation can run in both directions. Detainees may lie to curry favor, and investigators, under public pressure, may ask questions that steer attention towards certain details. That creates a feedback loop where particular types of testimony are rewarded, encouraging poorly grounded claims. Most importantly, words without corroboration are fragile in court. Physical evidence, independent witnesses, or digital records ground a story in verifiable fact. Without those anchors, a statement remains just one person's version of events. Courts have long treated jailhouse testimony with caution for these reasons. Motive, malleability, and a historical record of wrongful convictions linked to unreliable informants. Families can be given false hope, resources can be deployed chasing misleading leads, and public opinion can harden around incomplete narratives. For investigators, the prudent path is clear. Treat such statements as leads that demand immediate, meticulous corroboration, timelines, forensics, interviews, and checks against phone, travel, and financial records, rather than as conclusions to accept. The alleged admission that the death was an accident and that the child was buried secretly demands that same level of caution. If true, those words would answer urgent questions. How did Emmanuel die? And where might his remains be found? But those phrases are slippery and packed with competing meanings. Calling something an accident may suggest a sudden, unplanned tragedy, or it may be a softer description for long-term neglect that became fatal. Each interpretation pushes investigators down different paths. An instantaneous accident would show specific injury patterns. Chronic neglect would be reflected in medical records, developmental decline, or testimony about living conditions. Meanwhile, the claim of a secret burial is operationally immediate and costly. Searching for buried remains in a large, rugged landscape requires precise leads, a timeline, names, a location, and an understanding of how and when a burial took place. Without coordinates, search teams face difficult choices. Follow a vague tip and risk wasting manpower. Ignore it and risk missing the only path to recovery. There is also the danger of metaphor. If buried was meant figuratively, to suggest the truth was hidden rather than a body interred, investigators can be led into futile excavations. The possibility that a statement was relayed secondhand or made by someone seeking a deal further complicates its weight. Until the admission connects to outside evidence, forensic, digital, or independent testimony, it remains a compelling but unproven part of the wider story. The justice system's skepticism about jailhouse informants didn't arise from distrust alone, but from a long record of cases where such testimony proved unreliable. Courts, defense lawyers, and prosecutors approach informant testimony with procedural safeguards because confident, detailed-sounding accounts can still be shaped by incentives or poor memory. Defense attorneys routinely probe benefits offered to informants, plea deals, sentence reductions, protective custody, because those incentives can explain why someone might tailor their story. Judges allow cross-examination meant to expose motive, and juries are instructed to weigh those motives when considering credibility. Prosecutors aware of the fragility of such testimony often seek corollary evidence before relying on it at trial. Forensic data, independent eyewitness accounts, contemporaneous notes. Appellate courts have overturned convictions when informant testimony was later shown to be false or materially altered. As a result, investigative practice now emphasizes contemporaneous recordings, written statements under oath where possible, and vigorous corroboration. The courtroom's caution influences how investigators operate. If a confession is to carry weight, it needs ironclad, independent anchors. Without them, the legal threshold for conviction, proof beyond a reasonable doubt, becomes far harder to meet. Even before any whisper from inside a jail, Emmanuel's medical records raised red flags. Repeated clinical visits, unexplained injuries, and noticeable behavioral shifts are patterns that clinicians are trained to notice, and they should have prompted urgent inquiry. Yet reports alone do not protect. The effectiveness of mandatory reporting depends on the receiving system's capacity to act. Clinicians operate under time constraints and high caseloads, and records are often siloed across different providers. When child protective services are underfunded or overloaded, reports can be delayed or deprioritized. The result is that warnings, while documented, can fail to trigger decisive action. Differentiating between accidental injuries and inflicted harm requires careful assessment and time, but when multiple signals stack up, repeated unexplained wounds, frequent emergency visits, developmental decline, the balance of suspicion should prompt immediate intervention. In Emmanuel's case, medical documentation points to concern, but the chain linking those concerns to protective action appears to have broken down, revealing structural weaknesses, stretched resources, bureaucratic inertia, and poor interagency communication. Community voices often hold missing pieces of this kind of puzzle. Neighbors, teachers, and family friends observe day-to-day life in ways professionals cannot. For Emmanuel, multiple local observers raised alarms. Sounds of distress, changes in routine, behavioral differences. And those reports matter because repeated, independent observations create a weight of evidence that should trigger heightened response. But the bridge from community reporting to institutional action is fragile. Intake systems must triage thousands of reports, and in many regions protective services are overwhelmed. When repeated neighborhood complaints are parsed as isolated incidents rather than cumulative risk, a child remains exposed while bureaucratic processes debate priorities. That gap inflames community frustration and may lead to public advocacy or pressure campaigns, which sometimes force action but are an unreliable substitute for a responsive system. To strengthen child safety, intake systems should flag multiple independent reports about the same household and escalate them. Communities should receive feedback within confidentiality limits, so their reports don't vanish in a bureaucratic queues. When one agency fails to act decisively, others are often expected to fill the gap, but in practice failures stack. Emmanuel's case shows how medical signals, community warnings, and protective services records existed in parallel without the connective tissue needed to turn those signals into protection. Systemic failure usually accumulates through many small breakdowns. Unlinked electronic records, triage protocols that treat similar reports differently, understaffed units with impossible caseloads, and these frictions ultimately create holes in the safety net. Accountability becomes diffuse as agencies point to each other's limitations rather than addressing shared shortcomings. Fixing this requires structural change, standardized data sharing, more funding for frontline workers, joint accountability metrics, and multidisciplinary rapid response teams that act when medical, community, and social signals converge. Without these changes, the same patterns of partial responses and slow action will persist, leaving vulnerable children exposed. Apparent silence in a missing child investigation shapes both public perception and investigative strategy. Emmanuel's mother's reticence has left a vacuum that speculation and rumor quickly fill, altering how the public engages with the case and sometimes reducing investigative momentum. Silence can stem from many sources: fear of retaliation, distrust in authorities, overwhelming grief, or even a legal strategy advised by counsel. Each of these is a human response that deserves empathy even as it complicates information gathering. Public reaction, especially on social media, often lacks that nuance and can quickly turn silence into presumed guilt, which further isolates families and makes cooperation less likely. Investigators must balance sensitivity with persistence, offering psychological support, confidentiality assurances, and careful outreach while pursuing alternate evidence lines. Treating silence as definitive proof of anything is both unfair and strategically damaging. Silence itself is a complex signal that can reflect fear, trauma, guilt, or self-preservation, and each rationale demands a different investigative response. Fear may require protective measures and confidentiality. Trauma may need counseling and slow, non-pressure engagement. Guilt may necessitate legal advice and careful interviewing. Self-preservation could respond to clear explanations about rights and the benefits of cooperation. Forensic interviewers trained in trauma-informed methods can reduce the risk of re-traumatization and improve the chances of truthful disclosure. But these measures take time and resources. Meanwhile, investigators must continue building corroborative lines of evidence so that a lack of family cooperation does not stall the inquiry. Public commentators who equate silence with guilt miss these nuances and risk harming both families and investigations. The physical landscape around Cabazon compounds every difficulty. The desert flats, rocky washes, and mountain foothills create conditions in which remains and other evidence can be rapidly degraded or scattered. Heat accelerates decomposition. Scavengers disarticulate and disperse remains. Wind and shifting sands can bury or reveal traces unpredictably. A shallow burial that might be found in a woodland area can disappear into the desert's surface within days. Search technologies help. Drones can cover great distances, ground-penetrating radar can detect anomalies in suitable soils, and cadaver dogs can pick up scent trails under the right conditions. But each tool has limits, especially in rocky or mixed substrates common in desert foothills. Jurisdictional complexity adds another layer. Reservation lands, county lines, and major highways create opportunities for remains to be moved across boundaries, complicating coordination. Time is crucial. The longer searches are delayed, the more the environment erases evidence. For families, the cruel reality is that the land itself may be keeping the truth hidden, and for investigators, the terrain turns a missing person inquiry into a resource-intensive operation requiring forensic archaeologists, interagency cooperation, and sustained effort. Finally, the absence of a body reshapes the legal path forward. A recovered body provides forensic anchors: cause of death, injury patterns, toxicology, and often physical evidence linking a suspect to a scene. Without that anchor, prosecutors must rely on circumstantial webs, timelines, corroborated testimony, phone records, surveillance, and DNA or trace evidence to meet the standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Defense teams exploit gaps by attacking motives for testimony, memory lapses, and procedural missteps, and juries are often reluctant to convict where essential facts about death remain ambiguous. No body prosecutions are possible, but they demand extraordinary corroboration and meticulous investigation. Where that corroboration is lacking, reasonable doubt tends to prevail. This legal reality protects the innocent, but can leave families without closure, trapped between the desire for justice and the limits of what can be proven. Emmanuel's case threads together individual human frailty, institutional limits, and the raw force of landscape. A jailhouse whisper can point investigators where to dig, but it cannot replace verification. Repeated medical and community warnings show that multiple chances to intervene were missed, and systemic gaps allowed risk to persist. A mother's silence adds emotional complexity and affects public momentum, while desert terrain and the absence of a body make closure painfully elusive. The lessons are clear. Treat unverified confessions as leads that require fast, meticulous corroboration. Fund and reform child protection systems so repeated alarms trigger swift, coordinated responses. Engage with parental silence compassionately while maintaining rigorous inquiry. Plan searches that account for harsh terrain and cross-jurisdictional challenges. And recognize that justice without physical evidence demands extraordinary corroboration. These changes are how we honor children like Emmanuel, by learning from failures that let danger persist and by fixing the gaps so other families do not have to live with the same unanswered questions.